Hello, Chapter 18 today. The cardiovascular system, which includes our heart, our blood vessels, and the blood inside of them. And we are starting from blood. Part 1. Here's your table of contents as usual. And now, please, can you answer the question? Blood definition. What is blood? Take a moment, please, and think about it. Well, what is blood? Blood is a fluid, a liquid inside of our veins and arteries, but actually it is a tissue. It is a liquid connective tissue. So liquid connective tissue, which is located inside of our arteries, veins, arterioles, and our heart. That's what blood is. Now let's talk about functions of blood. And the main function of blood is transportation. Blood carries oxygen and nutrients to all body cells. Cells need oxygen to produce energy, and they need nutrients to build themselves, rebuild, repair, and to do their work. Next one, metabolic wastes. Those are chemicals that we do not need anymore, and they will be carried away from the cells. Carbon dioxide will be carried to the lungs and we exhale it, and all other wastes will be carried to the kidneys, where they will be eliminated from the body with urine. And also blood carries hormones from all of our endocrine glands to their target organs. Next function of blood is maintenance of homeostasis. Our blood regulates body temperature by absorbing heat from tissues, especially from working muscles, and distributing it through the body. Next one, buffers. Those special proteins that we have in our blood help us to maintain normal blood pH. Who remembers normal blood pH? Take your time, remember. Well, that would be... Okay, I will leave it to you. Please remember it, and remember that those would be two numbers. 7.35 to 7.45. Okay, next one. Blood also helps to maintain adequate fluid volume in the circulatory system. Our cells need water all the time for their activities, and where from they take that water? From the blood. Next function of the blood would be defense. Blood protects us against blood loss. That sounds strange, but that's how it is. If you have a small cut, plasma proteins and platelets inside of your blood start clot formation, and when blood clot is formed, it stops bleeding. It doesn't work for large cuts when an artery is severed, for example, but it works perfect for small cuts. Also, our blood protects us against infection. And those would be substances and chemicals we have in blood, antibodies, complement proteins, white blood cells that can defend us against bacteria and viruses. We will be talking a lot about it when we do our immune system. Now we need to talk about blood composition. Blood is made of blood plasma and formed elements. Formed elements, those would be those cells, red blood cells, or now you need to remember their name, erythrocytes. Here they are, lots of them. Then we have leukocytes. Here it is. Leukocytes are larger, and they usually have nucleus. Here it is a nucleus of different shape, and we have less of them comparing with red blood cells. So white blood cells or leukocytes. Mostly they are responsible for immunity, while red blood cells are responsible for carrying oxygen to our body cells. Finally, those tiny dots, they are not exactly cells, they are cell fragments, and those take part in stopping bleeding, protecting us against blood loss. If we put some amount of blood in a tube and centrifuge that tube, blood will separate into three portions. On the very bottom, there will be the heaviest elements, erythrocytes or red blood cells. And then there will be a thin layer of white blood cells, which is called buffy coat, right here. And finally, at the very top, there will be a lightest portion of blood plasma, which mainly is made of water with some proteins, nutrients, hormones in it. So, the percent of blood volume that is taken by red blood cells, this portion, erythrocytes, is called hematocrit. For males, hematocrit should be 42 to 55%. For females, it would be 37 to 47. Think a little bit why males are supposed to have a little bit more of red blood cells comparing with females. Well, the answer will be that males on average have more of a muscle mass. They have more skeletal muscles. Those muscles are larger, heavier comparing with females. And those muscles need oxygen for making energy on a constant basis, so they need more red blood cells. What exactly you need to know about blood composition? You need to know that blood is divided into plasma and formed element with percents. Then you need to know the content of blood plasma, how much is for proteins, 7%, how much is for water, regulatory proteins, that would be hormones, and other solutes. For each of those blood proteins, plasma proteins, you need to know their names, you need to know what are their main functions, and you need to know functions for water, for regulatory proteins, and for other solutes. Next one, for formed elements, you need to know also their amount in their formed element part of the blood, their site of production, major functions. So generally, you need to know these table. And right now we'll talk about the details. Blood is a sticky, opaque fluid. Its color can vary from scarlet in arteries to dark red in veins. Why? Because in arteries, blood is oxygenated. It has a lot of oxygen, which is lighter. Comparing with veins, where blood is deoxygenated and has a lot of carbon dioxide. pH of blood is from 7.35 to 7.45, as you know, and the temperature of blood is 38 degrees of Celsius. Blood makes about 8% of body weight, and amount varies depending on body size and weight. On average, males have 5 to 6 liters of blood, and females have 4 to 5 liters of blood. Blood plasma. 90% of it is water that we receive when we drink it, when we drink different juices, tea, coffee, with food, and also a small amount of water is produced inside of our body. Proteins are mostly produced by the liver. Main proteins will be albumins, 54 to 60%, and their function is to transport lipid molecules. They are responsible for creating and maintaining osmotic pressure, and they also work as buffers, maintaining blood pH. 35 to 38% of proteins are globulins. They also take part in transportation of lipids, carbs, hormones, ions, and also antibodies. And by transporting antibodies, they take part in fighting infections. So it's part of our immune system. 47% of proteins would be fibrinogen, and it is responsible for blood clotting. In blood plasma, between the cells right here, there is blood plasma, which is mostly water, but also, except proteins and water, there will be a lot of other substances, like nitrogenous byproducts of metabolism, lactic acid, urea, and creatinine. Most of the substances will be removed with urine when they go through the kidneys. Nutrients carried by blood would be glucose, your fuel for the cells, other types of carbs, and amino acids. A lot of electrolytes, they take part in different regulatory processes. Example, our muscles would not be able to contract without calcium. Respiratory gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide are carried in blood plasma, small amount of oxygen, and different hormones. Before you continue, please stop the video and answer the questions for part 1.1. Part 1.2. Now let's talk about formed elements of the blood. Cells. So white blood cells are large. You can see they have nucleus, and they are the only complete cells of the blood. Because they have nucleus, they have organelles. Red blood cells, here they are, or erythrocytes, they do not have nuclei or organelles. They are stuffed with protein called hemoglobin carrying oxygen. That's their main function. Next one, platelets are just cell fragments. They are not complete cells. Most of those formed elements survive in the blood for only a few days. For example, some types of leukocytes, white blood cells, can live for 4 to 9 days only. Red blood cells live a little bit longer, for up to 3-4 months. And most of blood cells originate in bone marrow, and they do not divide. It means when they are made and released into the bloodstream, they cannot divide and create new daughter cells. Hematopoiesis is a process of blood cell formation. Sometimes it's also called hemopoiesis. It's the same thing. In children, mostly hematopoiesis happens in their long bones, inside of the medullary cavity that has red bone marrow. In adults, mostly those would be flat bones, cranial and pelvic bones. Also, blood cells are made inside of the vertebra, sternum, and femur and humerus, proximal parts of them, proximal epiphysis. All the formed elements arise from stem cells inside of the red bone marrow. Here, those stem cells, they are called hemocytoblasts, or just stem cells. So their location is red bone marrow inside of the bones. Those cells are called multipotent because they can divide, they can proliferate and differentiate into different types of blood cells. For example, originally, stem cells differentiate into myeloid and lymphoid stem cells. Lymphoid stem cells later can become different types of lymphocytes. All other blood cells originate from myeloid stem cells. This would be red blood cells, erythrocytes, platelets, and all other types of white blood cells, basophils, neutrophils, eosinophils, monocytes. All of them are types of white blood cells, leukocytes, except lymphocytes. Development of blood cells from stem cells is initiated by special chemicals that are called hemopoietic growth factors. Example, erythropoietin or EPO is a hormone produced by the kidneys. When special receptors in kidney tubules feel that blood going through the kidneys is poor with oxygen, it prompts the production of erythropoietin, which goes to bone marrow and also in its turn prompts the production of red blood cells, erythrocytes. What is necessary for production of red blood cells? Nutrients, amino acids, lipids, and carbs. Also, iron is very important, and we have a lot of it. Most of it is inside of red blood cells in hemoglobin and inside of the liver, spleen, bone marrow. Inside of regular body cells called ferritin and hemosiderin. And also, it's transported loosely bound to the protein called transferrin. We'll talk about it a little bit later. Also, vitamin B12 and folic acid, both of them are necessary for cell division, so erythropoiesis, red blood cell production, is not possible without both of them. Summary of formed elements. For each formed element, for example, erythrocytes, you need to know its name, red blood cells or erythrocytes. You need to know both. You need to know their amount. For red blood cells, it will be 5.2 million, approximately 4.426 million in each microliter of blood. You need to be able to describe their appearance and you need to know their functions. And before we continue talking about each of those blood elements, blood cells, you please stop this video and answer the questions for part 1.2. Now we are going to talk about erythrocytes or red blood cells. Here they are. Pay attention that they are not spherical like balls. They have a shape of a donuts, biconcave discs. And they are anucleate. It means they do not have nucleus. They do not have other organelles. They are filled with hemoglobin, a special substance that can carry gases, mostly oxygen. Special proteins, especially spectrum, contained in the plasma membrane of red blood cells, makes them very flexible. So when they go through the tiny capillaries, they can bend, they can fold to match into those capillaries. And red blood cells are the major factor contributing to blood viscosity. The more red blood cells we have in the blood, the thicker the blood is going to be. Red blood cells have a very special structural characteristics. Again, their biconcave shape means that they have huge surface area comparing to their volume. Why is it important? That allows oxygen to get easily in and out of the red blood cells. It happens fast comparing if they were round like balls. Hemoglobin makes about 27% of substances inside of red blood cells, not counting water. They don't have other organelles, they do not have mitochondria, and ATP production inside of them doesn't use oxygen. It's anaerobic. So all the oxygen they get, they use for transportation to supply other cells. Red blood cells considered to be a fantastic example of complementarity of structure and function. So that protein, hemoglobin, inside of red blood cells that carries gases. Why we say gases? Because not only oxygen is transported by red blood cells, but also small amount of carbon dioxide. So hemoglobin binds irreversibly with oxygen. oxygen attaches itself to hemoglobin and then can disattach. Hemoglobin structure, it is made of proteins, 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. So that's alpha chain 1, alpha chain 2, beta chain 1, and beta chain 2. Each of those chains has heme pigment attached to it. That structure looking like a coin, that's a heme. And each of the hemes, there are 4 of them, 1 for each protein chain, has an iron atom attached to it. So when oxygen binds to hemoglobin, it attaches itself to that iron atom. Because we have 4 iron atoms in one molecule of hemoglobin, it means that each hemoglobin molecule can transport 4 oxygen molecules. So what happens? When red blood cells arrive to the tiny capillaries of lung, they receive oxygen from the lungs, and right now it is called oxyhemoglobin, hemoglobin carrying oxygen. It's bright red or ruby red or scarlet, and that's how arterial blood looks. It's bright. Blood in our aorta and large arteries. So arteries carry oxygen to the tissues, and that's where oxygen detaches itself from heme, from iron, and goes to the tissues. Right now, when hemoglobin is not carrying oxygen, it is called deoxyhemoglobin, and that makes blood darker. So blood in our veins that is returning from the tissues back to the heart, it's darker comparing with arterial blood. In some cases, hemoglobin can carry small amount of carbon dioxide. In this case, it's called carbaminohemoglobin. Please memorize all those 3 terms. Red blood cells live on average 3-4 months, and after that they become old, they become fragile, and macrophages, huge blood cells inside of blood vessels, take them inside, engulf them, and carry them mostly to the spleen. So here it is. That's a blood vessel. That is an old red blood cell, and it's taken inside of a huge macrophage. And inside of that macrophage, it's carried to their spleen, and in spleen it's broken into pieces, into those 4 protein chains, and heme and iron are separated. You must know what happens with each of those parts. First of all, proteins, globins. They are broken into amino acids and will be reused to make new cells. Next one, heme is separated from iron, and heme turns into the substance called biliverdin and later into the substance called bilirubin. It happens in the liver. Liver uses bilirubin to produce bile, and later bile is released in our digestive tract and helps us to digest fats. Now what happens to the iron? Iron ions bind to special protein called transferrin. That protein carries them into the liver, where iron will be stored as ferritin, or it goes straight to the bone marrow and will be used to make new red blood cells. Let's talk about homeostatic imbalances. Anemia. What is anemia? It's when blood has abnormally low oxygen carrying capacity. Different reasons can cause it, but blood cannot carry enough of oxygen for our cells. And it's not a disease itself, it's rather a sign of certain condition. When oxygen level is low in blood, it means that cells do not receive enough of energy and cannot support their normal metabolism. So that can cause fatigue, paleness, shortness of breath, chills, and other symptoms in patients. What can cause anemia? First of all, insufficient amount of erythrocytes, not enough of red blood cells. What can cause that? First of all, of course, bleeding. Acute when somebody has a wound, or chronic loss, for example, very heavy period in women, and that is called hemorrhagic anemia. Next one, hemolytic anemia. It's when there is enough of red blood cells enough of them produced, but they die, they rupture earlier than they supposed to. They do not live for 3-4 months. Something causes them to die early, and it can be some chemical agents, and there can be different reasons for that. And finally, aplastic anemia. It's when, because of some problem in the red bone marrow, our red bone marrow cannot produce red blood cells or cannot produce enough of red blood cells. It can be caused by radiation, for example. So, second cause of anemia, it's low hemoglobin content. So we have enough of red blood cells, but they are pale and they don't have enough of hemoglobin inside of them. The most common one would be iron deficiency anemia. It can be a secondary result of bleeding, hemorrhagic anemia, or commonly it can be inadequate intake of iron-containing foods. So deficiency of iron in your food, or impaired iron absorption. It means that patient eats enough of iron containing foods, but some problem in their stomach, for example, prevents them from absorption of that iron. Here is a list of foods rich in iron for you. Red meat, pork, poultry, seafood, beans, dark green leafy vegetables, dried fruit, iron-fortified foods like cereals, breads, and pastas. Pernicious anemia. It's when our body doesn't have enough of vitamin B12. There can be plenty of iron, but without vitamin B12, red bone marrow cannot produce hemoglobin. And sometimes a cause of it is lack of intrinsic factor produced in our stomach, which is needed for absorption of B12. So, some certain stomach problems like inflammation, gastritis, can cause pernicious anemia. And this condition is treated by injections of vitamin B12 or special medications. Sometimes there is enough of hemoglobin, but it's abnormal. For example, in case of a genetic hereditary condition, thalassemia, there is a lot of red blood cells, but they are thin, they are delicate, and they do not have enough of hemoglobin inside of them. So they cannot carry enough of oxygen. Another genetic condition is sickle cell anemia. It means that abnormal hemoglobin shows up usually in case of low oxygen situations. Red blood cells change their shape and turn into that sickle-shaped structures, very pale and poor with oxygen. And it's not only they cannot carry enough of oxygen, they also can block small blood vessels and cause a variety of serious problems. Painful joints, delayed growth, or even sometimes strokes. Polycythemia. What is that? too many of red blood cells. No, it's not a good thing. When we have too many of red blood cells, that makes our blood thick, which means increases blood viscosity. What can cause it? Cancer of bone marrow, when bone marrow starts producing a lot of red blood cells, and that is called polycythemia vera. Secondary polycythemia, when less oxygen is available at high altitude. When you go high in the mountains, it takes your body a few days to adjust to that because of difference in air pressure, and your body produces more red blood cells because of increased erythropoietin production. And finally, there is such a thing like blood doping, injection of oxygenated blood into an athlete before some sport event in attempt to enhance athletic performance. Usually they use the same blood of the same athlete saved earlier before, and that practice is illegal. Before you continue, please stop this video and answer the questions for Chapter 18, Part 1.3. Now we will talk about white blood cells or leukocytes. If we have about 4 to 5 million of red blood cells in each cubic millimeter of blood, the amount of white blood cells or leukocytes is about 10 times less, 5 to 10,000 in each cubic millimeter of blood. And if there are 11,000 or more of them, that condition is called leukocytosis. And it's a normal response to bacterial or viral infection. On average, they make less than 1% of total blood volume. And since they are answering to bacterial or viral invasion, they can do it staying in blood and fighting bacteria and viruses inside of the blood, or they can go outside of the blood vessels into the tissues and fight bacteria and viruses there. Please watch the animation how white blood cells work. The link is under the video. You can do it right now or after you watch the video. There are two main types of leukocytes: granular leukocytes or granulocytes and agranular leukocytes or agranulocytes. What's the difference? Visible granules that you can see in their cytoplasm. They are called cytoplasmic granules, and they stain specifically with right stain. So there are three types of them: neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, granulocytes. They all have lobed nuclei. They all are larger and shorter lived than red blood cells, and they all are phagocytic. What does it mean? They are capable to phagocytosis. Remember what it is. They are capable to surround, take inside, engulf either bacteria, virus in a vesicle, and then later destroy it. First type of granulocytes are neutrophils, and we have them 50 to 70% out of all white blood cells, so they are most numerous white blood cells. They also called polymorphonuclear leukocytes, and it means that their nucleus is made of several parts. They can have different shape, a different size, but they all are connected to each other. Usually there are 3 or 4 of those parts. They have lilac color when they are stained, and inside of those granules right here there would be hydrolytic enzymes or defenses. What's that for? When they take bacteria or viruses inside, and they are sometimes called bacteria slayers because they are very capable to phagocytosis. Those granules they can kill bacteria and viruses and digest them. Eosinophils, the second ones. We have 2 to 4% of eosinophils out of total amount of white blood cells. They are usually stained red or sometimes orange-like. They have bilobed nuclei, is made of 2 parts connected with each other, and their granules are also red or orange. They have 2 main functions. They can digest parasitic worms that are too large to be phagocytized. It means they don't take that worm inside. They just come up to it and insert those granules and kill that worm, digesting it. They also take part in immune response, and they play a role in allergy and asthma. So if you see that in your patient's blood amount of eosinophils is much higher than 4%, there's a good chance that they are suffering from some type of allergic reaction. The third type of granulocytes are basophils. Here they are. They have lots of granules, large granules, and sometimes there are so many granules that they cover the whole surface of basophil when you look at it under the microscope that you cannot even see the nucleus. Small amount of them can be found in the blood, up to 1%. Those granules contain histamine, and you remember that histamine is inflammatory chemical. It means it causes inflammation. It dilates blood vessels and causes other white blood cells to leave blood vessels and go to inflamed tissues to kill bacteria and viruses there. Now we'll talk about agranulocytes. There are 2 types of them, lymphocytes and monocytes. When you look at them under the microscope, you will not see any granules, but you will see their nuclei that either spherical or kidney-shaped. Lymphocytes. They are smallest white blood cells. They are just slightly larger than red blood cells, and each of them has a huge nucleus that takes almost all cell inside. We have about 25 to 45% of them, and mostly they are not in blood. They are in lymphoid tissue, like lymph nodes. They are a big part of our immune system. We'll talk a lot about each type of them when we study the immune system. Right now, you need to know that there are 2 types of them, T cells and B cells, and they both look alike. You cannot distinguish between them if you look at them under the microscope. The last type of white blood cells would be monocytes. We have 3 to 8% of them, and they are huge, the largest white blood cells. Their nucleus is shaped like a kidney or a bean, and the cytoplasm is pale with no granules. Usually they do not stay for a long time in the blood. After they are born and released into the blood, they travel for a while, then leave circulation, enter tissues, and become macrophages. So they phagocytize bacteria and viruses. So they are actively phagocytic cells, and they fight viruses, intracellular, located inside of the cell, bacterial parasites, and their amount usually is high when somebody is suffering from chronic infections. Chronic infection is the one that lasts usually longer than 1 month. All leukocytes have a relatively short lifespan. Some of them can live 49 days, and others can only live hours or several hours. So our bone marrow has to produce them all the time. And their production starts in bone marrow, but maturation of them can happen in other regions of lymphatic tissue, and those places where they mature are called germinal centers. Examples can be our thymus, that is in mediastinum. Leukocyte disorders. Leukopenia is abnormally low white blood cell count, and usually it's caused by certain drugs. Lymphoma is a form of cancer when there are a lot of malignant T and B lymphocytes are in lymphatic nodes, the spleen, they take lots of space, so that's lymphoma. And there is also cancer that is called leukemia. Actually, there are several types of them called leukemias. It's when our bone marrow produces too many of white blood cells. That condition can develop very fast, within months or even weeks, and that is called acute leukemia. Usually happens in children, but children have higher chances to recover from it. Chronic leukemia develops slower, usually in older people, and has worse prognosis. What exactly leukemia is? That's normal blood. Lots of red blood cells and platelets and some amount of white blood cells. When cancer develops in bone marrow and bone marrow starts producing lots of leukemic cells, white blood cells, that's called leukemic blast. They are huge, but they are undeveloped, immature, and so non-functional. They just take space, they make blood thick, and they are not capable to fight infections. So the patient, in spite of having such a huge amount of white blood cells, can easily die from overwhelming infections. Treatments of leukemia include irradiation, anti-leukemic drugs, and stem cell transplants. So we have red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Another name for them would be thrombocytes. And platelets are not cells technically, they are just cell fragments. In our bone marrow, under the thrombopoietin hormone regulation, which is produced in kidneys and liver, stem cells turn into megakaryoblast, then megakaryocyte, huge cells. And those huge cells, megakaryocytes, break into thousands of tiny pieces. Those pieces are called platelets or thrombocytes. They usually just floating in our blood. Under the microscope, they look like just dots, tiny fragments, and they are not active. But when bleeding happens, they get activated and they help to seal breaks in blood vessels to stop bleeding. To activate them, NO is needed, and that is nitric oxide. Disorders of platelets. When there are too many of them, that condition is called thrombocytosis, and that can trigger formation of unwanted blood clots, thrombosis, which can be dangerous. When there are not enough of platelets, that condition is called thrombocytopenia, and excessive bleeding can happen. So even from the small cut, there will be lots of bleeding. Please remember to answer the questions for Chapter 18, Part 1.4.